Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today on our webinar, Introduction to Enterprise Content Management in Office 365, with our special guest, Eric Shupps. My name is Ivan, and I'm a sales manager here at Syskit. We'll be soon joined by Eric and my colleague Mario, who will be showing us a demo after the presentation. Many of you already know us as a company, but for those who don't, let me briefly introduce you to Syskit. Syskit is a software development company founded more than 12 years ago. We develop products for Microsoft 365 governance, security, and auditing, as well as SharePoint on-prem administration. And we currently have more than 3,000 customers across the world. We have 5 products, including our famous SP-Docket for SharePoint on-prem documentation, as well as Syskit Point for Microsoft 365 governance. So before we start, just a few housekeeping rules. All registrants will receive a recording of the webinar within a few days. After Eric's presentations, we will have a short demo of Syskit Point showing how it can help you with your enterprise content management. And we will then have a Q&A session with Eric where you can ask him any questions that you might have. So please use the Q&A function on the right side of the screen to ask your questions throughout the webinar. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Eric Shupps. Eric Shupps is the Chief Technology Officer at Aptigent. He has worked with SharePoint, Azure, and other cloud technologies as a consultant, administrator, architect, developer, and trainer. Eric can be found on YouTube as a part of the Community Cloudcast show, on various podcasts and webinars, and speaking at conferences and events around the world. He also posts on his personal blog at ericshupps.com. I will now give a warm welcome and turn things over to Eric. Eric, are you ready?
I am, Ivan. Thank you for that kind introduction. It almost makes me sound like I know what I'm talking about. So I hope everyone can see my screen. Right, so we have a relatively small amount of time to cover a big topic. So the way we're going to approach this here is just jump into a few topical areas and try to provide some familiarity or at least some exposure to a number of features that are available in the platform for enterprise content management. We'll talk a little bit about what that is, how it works, go through some examples. Now, for those of you who still happen to be on-prem or in a hybrid environment, a lot of good news for you because many of the ECM features are basically unchanged going all the way back to the 2010 product. There are some new features around security and compliance, especially around compliance that we'll talk about in the second half of the presentation or as we get a little bit further down the road. There and some changes that are being made to some of the core functionality around things like content types in the platform. And we'll discuss some pieces of those, but this is a pretty large topic, not something we can do justice to in really an hour. So what I'm hoping to do here is, as I said, spark some ideas, give you some exposure, and then you can start your investigation as to which elements of the ECM stack in SharePoint may work best for you in your cloud journey, and which ones you can start to implement immediately, and which ones you need to do a little bit more planning for down the road. For those of you who want to get in touch with me, here's my contact information. You can reach out to me via any of these mechanisms. These slides, I believe, will be available from this presentation. There may already be a PDF that you can review, but you can get them and go through them at your leisure. And so let's go ahead and jump right in. We'll do a little bit of intro. We'll talk about content creation and management, and then we'll move into the content protection. Want to try and do as much demo of the platform as possible, but there is some background that we need to talk about and some basics that we need to go through before we can get to that point. So for those of you unfamiliar with the concept of ECM or enterprise content management, what we're really referring to is a set of features that allows you to manage your information in a more structured and tactical way inside of the platform. Beyond just, we're going to throw a bunch of things in a document library and hope for the best. ECM is really about classification, taxonomies, information architecture, protection of that content throughout its entire life cycle. Think of the document management process as having a complete life cycle from beginning to final disposition and all the elements that go along with that in the stack. This is a larger industry outside of Microsoft. So there are plenty of ECM tools, some of which you may be familiar with, that are standalone platforms on their own, things like Documentum that you may have been exposed to in the past. And those focus on specifically on content lifecycle management without all the additional features that SharePoint brings to the table or that the Office 365 stack makes available. And I'm going to jump between saying SharePoint and Office 365. I'm really talking about the entire feature set from SharePoint Online through to the components that you have in the Office 365 Admin Center. And by extensions, that would include Teams with content being stored in document libraries. However, Teams is a little bit of a different animal because it's really loosely structured content and not very tightly managed. We'll talk about that a little bit more shortly. What Microsoft has done very smartly over the years is integrated ECM features into the overall SharePoint platform. SharePoint is not in and of itself an ECM system. It's not designed specifically to do one task of enterprise content management. What it has is a set of features that enable you to apply ECM principles to the content that you have. And from that perspective, they've done a really, really good job of making ECM accessible to the masses and also allowing you to pick and choose which of those feature sets make sense for you. Depending on your industry, you may work with highly controlled or loosely controlled information. If you're in the finance sector, for example, there's lots of rules and regulations that apply to how you have to manage information. But like us and Syskit, if you're in the software business, well, not so much. Our content is much more loosely structured than those of, say, banking or healthcare or heavy manufacturing or chemicals handling or biosciences or what have you, that have very strictly controlled processes. The good news is that we're on Office 365. We can pick and choose which of these elements we want to include in our ECM journey and inside of our own organization and how we want to put those pieces together. In helping you define how that puzzle works, I really want to simplify it down to three main areas: the creation of content, the management of content, and the protection of content. Now, this used to be pretty simple because the creation of content was we went onto our computers and we created a Word document or Excel spreadsheet, and that was the content that we were working with. But of course, over time, that has become more complex. Not only do we have multiple mechanisms for generating content, but we have multiple types of content now that we're dealing with, from multimedia to things that are very hard to capture as a content element, things like chats inside of Teams. What is that? It's not a document, it's not a forum, it's not a blog post, it's not a piece of textual content, it's not an image or video. It's a collection of all these things into a stream. How do we treat that as a manageable object? So as technology is changing, the concept of ECM is changing, and how we manage that overall content from all these different formats is an ever-changing process as well, making the ECM managers' responsibilities even more difficult as we get more and more of these types of content sources that we never envisioned when the journey started. So let's focus on some of the core elements here. ECM as a concept is pretty straightforward, or I should say shares a lot of common elements regardless of the platform that you're on. And it usually starts with defining some sort of classification hierarchy in a taxonomy. And that can be structured or unstructured. Structured taxonomies typically involve things like managed metadata and document tagging and naming conventions, and even inside of document where you may have tagging inside of documents or templates that you have to use. Sometimes it's how the content relates to each other in terms of what regulatory requirements to determine for a specific set of materials you must have document A, document B, and document C. But at the end of the day, a structured taxonomy is really some sort of organizational hierarchy of that data and information. Whereas an unstructured taxonomy is something that we like to refer to in the vernacular as the folksonomy, meaning that it's something that comes from the ground up. It's endemic to a particular organization. Users sort of define the hierarchy themselves as opposed to a hierarchy being imposed on them from the top down. And sometimes it's not direct hierarchical relationships. Sometimes it's ad hoc relationships. And you can see these two different types of concepts being applied within Office 365 with different mechanisms that Microsoft has taken over the last few years to try and bring these together. Structured would obviously be managed metadata and the term store. Unstructured would be things like Delve, where and to a certain degree, even the new Synapse stuff, where you're looking for derivations of classification based on keywords or certain types of sentence structures or content structures, or the way that users have applied, ad hoc hashtags or things to content. Those are unstructured taxonomies. It still defines relationships and thus is a taxonomy, but it's just not pushed from the top down. Neither one is better than the other, although in true ECM methodology, structured taxonomies are preferred because they're more controllable and thus the output is more controlled. They do have some advantages though, one way or the other. One of the biggest advantages that you can leverage inside of the Office 365 platform, and especially in SharePoint, is metadata. The more and better metadata that you have, the easier it is to locate and associate content. Now, metadata always invokes a pretty strong reaction from both SharePoint administrators and users. SharePoint practitioners love it because of the capabilities we get for organization, moves us away from these horrific folder structures that we've relied on in the past in file shares. And we can even apply dynamic navigation elements to metadata. Users don't like metadata because it's an extra hurdle that they have to overcome when they're creating their information and putting it into the system. Whenever you require a user to fill out 10 or a dozen fields when they upload a document, you're going to get resistance. And thus users are going to look for ways around that system and try and find backdoors to make that happen. The best type of implementations that I've seen are a combination of both the structured and unstructured, with core metadata where you need it, and unstructured metadata where it can help. There's also an educational process here because a lot of users are resistant to metadata just because they don't like the extra steps that they have to take, but they don't understand the benefits. One of the greatest areas of success that we have when we're trying to implement an ECM strategy in an organization that hasn't had one or has had a very loose one is to demonstrate the difference in search results between documents that are unstructured, just dumped into a document library with no metadata organization, versus the findability of documents that have proper metadata applied. People always complain, well, search, you can't really find anything. Well, you can if you structure your documents properly and if you implement metadata. And when users see that in action, they become less resistant to the whole concept of metadata. So we always like to do a show and tell. Here's your document library without metadata, sad face. Here's your document library with metadata and search, happy face. Much easier to find information that you're looking for. But metadata isn't the only tool we have in our toolbox. We can also do things like tagging, naming conventions, and classification that we do automatically. Sometimes metadata is things that we can apply without involving the user. So we can take, for example, a naming convention. Users are pretty good, by and large, I've discovered in my experience, at working with naming conventions that have been applied in the organization that makes sense to them, right? So they understand why you need to have a naming convention for a document that has a department number and a project number and some sort of definitionary tag to it, and year and date. They get that. They understand because they work with this information, so they know what these things mean, and they don't mind, for the most part, doing naming conventions. Well, if we get them to do a proper naming convention, we can then pull that naming convention apart in a workflow behind the scenes and apply metadata to the item in the document library or in the list, such that the metadata is there. The user doesn't have to take any additional action. They can just upload their document. So we kind of, to use an American phrase, kill two birds with one stone, which is we've gotten the user to give us something structured, just structured enough to get what we need, but not too structured so they're resistant to the idea. I hope that concept comes across and makes sense about structured naming conventions and how we can turn that into metadata. But we can also look at tagging inside of documents. I've found that users are much less resistant to metadata when they use the document information panel in Word, because it seems to be in context. They're working with the document, they fill out a few fields at the top. They don't seem to mind as much, but they seem, for whatever reason, to be really resistant to when they click the upload button into SharePoint to be presented with a SharePoint form that they have to fill out. Same fields, same information, but they just tend to react to it better inside of the document. So that's another way that you can implement that. Of course, all of this talk about metadata leads to terms, because metadata that's just the same information being presented in 20 different ways because everyone calls it something else, or everyone has a shorthand term, or it's multilingual, and so we're all talking about the same thing but we're using different words in our native language to describe it, can be really challenging. In fact, it can make the whole process worse and not better. Thus, we have defined and structured terms and managed metadata, allowing the user to pick and select the information that they're looking for, and allowing us as the overall ECM implementer to apply things like synonyms and translations to those terms so that the user can pick, for example, the word in Spanish, casa, and we know that it means house in English, and it's the same term inside of the system. The system sees it and treats it the same way. Term stores are great. They obviously come with sets of advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is we get to structure all that data. We can use it for navigation and hierarchies. Disadvantage is that users are stuck with the sort of this rat's nest maze of having to drill down in to find the particular term that they want. It doesn't always make sense to them how those are being applied. And it's just a little bit of an extra step that they have to go through when they're putting something together. And if you get too many of these in a field, it's a slog for the user. Click, 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 drill down, click, next field, click, drill down, drill down, drill down. They don't like that very much. This can be another place where we have an opportunity to choose from sets of terms in, say, a workflow behind the scenes and apply that metadata based on the sets of terms. So you want to balance it. Don't go too overboard with the number and depth of your term sets, but show the users how managed terms can be effective. And I'll give you an example that I use all the time. We worked with a customer who had big manufacturing equipment, and they had these huge machines that were on a shop floor that had all of this documentation associated with them, lots of material safety data sheets and maintenance manuals and maintenance schedules and repair information, just tons of stuff on these items. Well, internally, the organization referred to one of these big machines as Big Blue because it was big and it was blue. It made sense. And everybody in the organization knew what Big Blue was. But you can't really put Big Blue in your auditable maintenance records for an item, right? You need things like the actual name and SKU number of the object and the location. So by creating managed metadata with synonyms, people could type in Big Blue, and we could even in our search associate that synonym with the proper SKU number that we had in the managed metadata in the term store, so that whenever we saw Big Blue in a document or a search result was put in for Big Blue, we knew that that was associated with the SKU XU295B7 or whatever the SKU was for that particular item. And it worked both ways then. The users continued on carrying on with their vernacular for the item, but the organization now had structured capabilities for managed metadata that was auditable and made sense for their maintenance records. One of the ways that we implement structured data, in fact, one of the primary ways is through content types in SharePoint. We probably all worked with content types before. You're probably familiar with these. It's just taking a list and set of columns and putting them at the site level so that they can be reused. This is changing a bit in Office 365. You probably have seen this in your tenant. We're going to see it in the demo where we go to the site content types, and it's different than the classic view that we used to see, and a bunch of stuff is missing. It's coming. They're working on it. That is one of the early features that they're trying to fix. It's a bit rough around the edges at the moment in the modern experience, but the core concept is the same. And content types can be really handy, especially if we do things like syndication, where we create a content type for something like a financial report. And then that financial report has not only a set of fields, but it also has a template associated with it. So when you go to a document library and you say new financial report, you get a document properly structured with all the fields that it needs. You can fill everything out. You can set the settings in the dip. You can save it, and you know how to transit that over its lifetime in content types. And we're going to talk about how important those are for records here in just a moment. SharePoint has a concept called content type syndication, where you can syndicate that. So you create a content type hub, you define your content types in the content type hub, and then other sites can subscribe to them. And this makes it really easy to manage them in one place so that you don't have to recreate them over and over. And when you have to change things like the template that's associated with content type, you change it in one place, and it gets published and pushed down to the other sites. Now, there's several different ways you can implement this, and I'll just real quickly, we'll just look at that in Office 365. So most of the time you designate a site as a content type hub, and that's all it does. It doesn't have to do just that. It can be any site in your organization, but a content type hub is a useful construct to have. And this is where you would define all of your content types. So your typical things that you would put together. So we have, for example, we're going to use this throughout our demo, something called a financial report. And in this financial report, we describe our fields. And then when we've enabled, we've designated this as our content type hub. And then we can enable publishing. And from the publishing, we can make changes and we can push this out. Now, notice this looks different than it did in classic SharePoint, and it's missing a bunch of stuff. Even when you go to advanced settings, not all the stuff is there that used to be there. When you click edit, you're missing a lot of the fields that you had before. This is part of the transition process over to the new content type publishing procedure. But the base concept around syndication and publishing is the same. I can go to another site here and go into my site settings. And in my site settings, I'll have my content type publishing set up, and I can subscribe to the financial report. So you see that it's subscribe, financial report, and whenever I publish changes to that, all the subscribers will get the changes that have been pushed down. So I manage my content types in one place, push them out throughout the organization. Very handy way for managing your content types and keeping a handle on them all in one place and using them throughout the organization. Now, I know content types have some issues. There's bugs that have been in them since the 2007 release that are still there. It's not perfect, but it is really, really good. And if you're going to take the next step to go from content types into records management, which is a natural transition, if you're doing ECM, you're going to need content types to rely on. I have worked with customers who have used this a little bit, some who've used it maybe a little bit too much. I would recommend finding a balance. Not everything needs to be a content type. Not everything needs to be managed that way. Not every document library needs to have 300 different content types associated with it. So have some care when you're publishing down content types. Publish them or have the site subscribe to the ones that they really need, and not necessarily everything in the organization that they're looking for, or that they may need at some point in the future, because not every site uses all the content types that you may have in your organization. Some are specific to accounting, some are for HR, some are for legal. No reason to blast those out to every document library everywhere. Now, doing proper metadata also helps us with navigation. Navigation is a multifaceted problem. I'm just talking about it in the overall concept of ECM here. But if you are doing navigation or doing managed metadata and you're still working in the classic views in SharePoint, you have the ability to do managed metadata navigation inside of your document libraries, which are super handy because it gives you a way beyond the typical column filters to drill down further into your content. And you can do things like picking from a set of managed metadata values and only showing documents in the library that have those that information. But you can also tie your navigational structures to your term store so that you can create menus that drive overall top level navigation based on your managed metadata hierarchy. This is part of your overall taxonomy. One of the most common ones is when you're doing an organizational navigation structure and you have like country, region, city, and then facilities, right? And so you would have a navigation drill down where you could walk through that. Well, that hierarchy is probably going to apply to lots of other things. So you would want to implement it as a term set and then use that term set when you're classifying documents. You can also use it for navigation. So you sort of get double bang for your money, as it were, in doing both navigation within document libraries, filtering and views of content, and you get top level navigation from it as well. That's changing as the concept moves to more of these hero menus and top level. You know, we have our hub sites, and then we have individual sites collection below them. And of course, as we're moving from lots of subsites to a flattened site collection model, this is changing, and thus your navigation will change as well, and your metadata hierarchy has changed as well to facilitate it. But the tools are still there in your tool set to use. Now, one of the most powerful concepts that we have for ECM is records. Records are a very specific type of document control. And what we mean when we say something is a record is that once it has been created and declared as a record, it cannot be changed. It is immutable. It is fixed for a period of time. Think of material safety data sheets that are published. I know that's a US thing, but a lot of European governments do very similar things where you have a chemical composition of something, or all of the dangerous elements that are included, or if you're doing food manufacturing, right, you have all of the internal ingredients and things listed, and it's a predefined set of reports that you have to get the proper regulatory approval for that piece of information. Well, you can't go back and change that after it's been published. If you included a toxic element in the food that you produced, even though at the time it may not have been considered a toxic element, we can't just go back and fix that later. It has to be immutable when it was released, right, and not changed afterwards. The same with things like health records. You can't be going back and munging with health records or employment records or educational records, etc. So we want documents, content that we can work on, that we create in our collaborative mechanism or our team space, however that is, whether it's in Teams or SharePoint or however it is that we're doing it. We're working on something and we may be doing versioning as we go along, but at some point, this content is fixed point in time. That's it, it's done. We're now going to declare it as a record. And when we do so, there are things that go along with records, like disposition policies and holding policies, and they're treated in a very specific way inside of Office 365. There is something called a record center, or also known as a repository. This is where you take content that you have worked on, say in a team site, and you send it to a repository. And in that repository, you have something called a drop-off library. That's just where everything goes. Everything gets dumped into here. You send it to the repository, it goes in the drop-off library. Based on the content type of the document, it then gets routed to a disposition library based on rules that you have defined in a content organizer or router. And then once it's there are policies that apply to that. How long is it kept for? What do you do with it when it reaches the end of its life cycle, etc. And you have things like filing plans that you can define as to how these things are managed. This is important because not all records are kept forever. In fact, in many cases, records have a life cycle. If in the United States, 7 years is typical for things like tax returns and financial documents. Some legal documents very much the same. Some have longer, some have shorter life cycles. But you don't want to keep those things around, especially if they're litigatable after the period of time where they need to be disposed, right? Sometimes too much information can be a bad thing in a lawsuit. So you want to dispose of these things appropriately when the disposition life cycle has occurred. And the record center, the repository, gives you rules that allow you to do that. The content organizer determines where it goes out of the drop-off library and where it gets transited to, and then where it gets transited to has the retention policies applied to it. Now, before we jump in and look at that, we're going to look at those here in just a second. I just want to briefly mention document sets because these are also a very powerful tool that we have at our disposal. But document sets are basically a custom folder type. And I know we've said for years that folders are bad, but when it comes to document sets, folders are good, as long as we don't nest them. And what this does is allow us to take a group of documents and treat it as one single entity. For example, if you've ever bought a home or done a real estate transaction, you know that there's a bunch of documents involved, and you go into closing and you got to sign all this stuff, and you walk out with this big folder under your arm of 100 documents, and your wrist hurts because you've been signing stuff for an hour. What happens behind the scenes is the title company then takes that folder and applies an identifier. Usually it's a plot number or plat number or something associated with the property. It gets a specific identifier. And then whenever they need to reference any document in that group, they're going to reference it by that number, and they're going to go to that folder and pull out the whatever declaration you made or legal document that was signed. Okay, but there's one entity, and that is this set of title documents. Well, document sets provide that. It's a folder group of documents. They all get the same metadata applied to the folder. So you have consistent metadata for each one of the items. And when you are done with it, so when in our example, when you have closed on the property, you can send that to a record center. It gets created as a zip file, goes in with the content type associated with it, goes into the drop-off library and gets transited. And the whole group of documents is treated as one entity. So you don't have to worry about if there's 100 documents in it. They're all managed as one and sent off. Very powerful. It'll be interesting to see how they deal with these going forward in the modern UI, because there's a special landing page for document sets. That's cool that you can extend, but it was very developer-y to get that extended, and I'm hoping that they'll give us some more capabilities for that in the modern interface, hopefully. All right, you can also do managed properties for search when you are defining your search queries. If we have metadata, want to make sure we can find things, so you can go into the search infrastructure and you can set up managed properties to make things easier to find. So when you're doing searches, it can narrow down on the search results that you're looking for. And then you can define results sources that are collections of settings to make it easier to find. So if you have a content type, you've got this metadata associated with the content type, you go in and set up your managed properties in search, and then you can set a result source for financial records that allows you to search for all financial records in the organization, for example. Okay, so just real quick, because I want to move into the DLP policies. Whoops. The DLP policies in Office 365, because there's some cool stuff there. Just talking about a record center, if you haven't worked with one before, it's a special site collection template type. You create it as a record center. When you get it, you have this managed record center link that lets you do things like describing policies, and it gives you this little walkthrough for doing things like content organizer rules. And a content organizer rule will say, for a particular content type, what do I do with this content type? Well, I'm going to send it to this particular place. And I'm going to give it a priority. So here's where it goes. And am I going to change any of the naming convention, right? Do I need to put an alternate name on it, et cetera? Do I need to create folders for the value? So there's rules that you can apply here in the content type. We also refer to this as a router. And this is what looks at the drop-off library. And then it says, oh, you're a financial report. I'm going to remove you into a specific location. So if I look in my contents here, I have a library called Archive Financial Reports. This is where I'm sending all of my financial reports that gets created. You can see a document ID has been applied. If you haven't used these before, this is a unique identifier you can apply to each document. It's customizable. You can implement it at the record center level. And within your library, you can go to the library settings, and if you go into information management policy settings, you can define the policy for this particular item. So here I have a financial report, and it's going to have a policy, but I need to jump up to the content type to see the policy. So this is where we define the retention and disposition of this document. So we can say, okay, what is this? If it's created plus in 7 years, I want to move this to the recycle bin, and I can do this in stages, right, where I have multiple retention stages. So at 5 years it goes here, at 7 years it goes here, at 10 years it goes here, and some additional fields that we have or settings that we can enable, such as, is there an audit trail for this? How are we going to audit? The audit log then shows up in Office 365, which is searchable, so that you can go then and see what happened, when was it transited, right? What rule applied when it was transited, et cetera. Where is it now? You can turn on things like editing, checking in or out, center, and capture all of these events. You can apply barcodes to your documents, and even insert labels into the document itself. So you can see here, it's just got some examples of how you've done that. Here's a little font and whatnot. So you can create these. So here you have a little example of how it's going to look when you put a tag on that document. So you've got these policies that apply to it. These are not sensitivity labels. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute. All right, but these are retention policies that define what happens to that document. So you could have all these libraries with different retention policies applied to them, and what happens to them when they're done. Just dispose, delete, permanently deleted, put in a recycle bin, or whatever. A really powerful way to manage your structured content through the entirety of its life cycle. So let's talk about some of the new features available to us in data loss protection and in the Compliance Center in Office 365. It used to be security and compliance, now it's split out, security or compliance. Obviously, we have to pay attention to security permissions and external sharing and auditing and reporting that we've turned on or enabled in our organizations. That's not really ECM, that's more governance around our process, but we do want to enable sharing controls for certain types of information, make sure we've enabled or disabled external sharing in the appropriate places. In terms of data loss, we want to make sure that things aren't leaking out of the organization that don't need to. So we want to define policies and define sensitive types of information so that they don't get exposed and or sent to places that we don't want them to be sent to. So there's various pieces that we have. We classify our content, we have policy templates and whatnot. And we can also implement rights management such that when a document is sent out of our organization, a set of rights and properties transit with it. Now, this applies specifically to Office documents, and it applies to Office 365 users. When sent to users outside of the organization, there's not quite as many capabilities there, but it can be locked down to a certain degree. If it's a Word document and they open Word, there's certain things that it won't let it do, but they're best used within the organization for applying these labels and managing them internal. We'll look at an example of that here in just a moment. But it allows this protection to flow with the object and not necessarily be associated with a document library or a site that it's available with. And these are extensible. There's SDKs and stuff that you can implement if you want to extend these. They keep changing a little bit over time. Was called Azure Rights or Azure Information Rights Management, then it was Azure Rights Management, and now they sort of keep changing the name a little bit, but the basic concept is the same. You can do this on-prem with an Azure Rights Management server if you want to, but it's primarily done in Office 365 in a cloud construct. Depending on the cloud that you're in, not all features are available in all cloud types. So if you're on GCC High or DoD 365, some of these capabilities may not be available to you yet in your tenant. One of the great things that we have in Office 365 is our audit trail, and our audit trails go across multiple repositories: Teams, OneDrive, Exchange, SharePoint, so we can look for and do content searches across a wide swath of information and discover these things as well. So let's look very quickly at some of these policies, and then I'll turn it back over to the Syskit folks for a brief demo from their side. But we start at the Compliance Manager. And in the Compliance Manager admin blade here, we have a bunch of different capabilities that are available to us. Let's start with data loss prevention here. And let's look at a DLP policy that we've applied. So we have a financial record. We've defined this as a type, and we have a policy that's associated with this type. So I can edit this policy and say that my financial records, what locations apply to this policy that we've created. SharePoint sites, and here you can see the repositories that I talked about: Exchange, OneDrive, Teams chat. So if I upload one of these documents in a Teams chat, is it going to apply this to that as well? And we even now have Power BI in preview state for our locations. So you can pick and choose. Let me back up. You can also choose which sites if you were to choose, say, SharePoint, do you want to have particular sites, or does this policy apply to all sites across the board? Then we have some rules. So if there's high volume or low volume on our advanced rules, right, we can test our policy out. We can turn it right on, or just say, hey, we're going to set this off and just be done with that, or we're just going to put it in holding for a while. So let's jump back out of that. So we're defining our policies there. We can set alerts when things have violated these policies. So we can set up our alerting where these are alerts that show up here, and we set those alerts as part of our policies. We can even define some endpoints here. So things that you can do by the particular endpoint that they're transiting. So pretty comprehensive things that we have available to us there. We can also, we jump back up here to policies, see what type of policies that we have. So here's some DLP policy, but we also have some retention policies in our information governance that may apply to certain particular types of documents. And here's where we can do things like creating labels. So I'm going to add a label to a particular document, and we can have retention. Here, let me just edit rather than create a new one. Our label, and we'll edit this one. There we go. So I can apply this label and have retention settings. What do I want to do when something is labeled for retention with these particular labels applied? What happens here in this policy? So this is kind of mixing what we saw in a record center with higher tenant level concepts around retention. So you can see these ECM concepts bubbling up to the top of the tenant. We also have our information protection, where we can take things and apply, say, sensitivity labels based on the classification of information. So there's lots of different classifications that can be applied. So over in security, we can define our classification and say, this is a social security number, or this is a driver's license number, or this is a bank account number, or a credit card number. So we define those, and there's a whole bunch of them that come out of the box already in Office 365. And we can add our own or modify the ones that are there, and they're available for lots of different countries. Obviously, it's not comprehensive, but it gives you a good set of stuff to start with. So we've done one here that includes a social security number, which in America is 3 digits, a dash, 2 digits, a dash, and 4 digits. So that would be an SSN. So we have something called protected personal information, and we can label things as having this classification, but we can also find things. It can automatically look for, in a search or an e-discovery, we can look for things that have this content in them. So when we have a label, we've defined a label here. So I'm just say we can create a new label here, and so we would say test, right? And then what's our scope of the label? Files and emails, right? Groups and sites, Azure Purview. What do we want to do? Do we want to crypt them, or do we just want to mark the content? So if you see content, for example, if you flagged an email as having personally identifiable information in it. It can apply a label to the email, and you'll see it when the email gets sent. The next person who looks at it as it goes through the chain, or anyone who looks at it from that point forward, will see a label applied to it. We can also then automatically encrypt those. So let's say we're going to mark the content of the files, right? What is our content marking? We can turn it on. We can add a watermark, etc. Let me show you this in practice and how this works. We have a document here. All right, here's our document. And you'll note that I have what looks like a social security number here in it. And I have this sensitivity available. Once I've installed the Azure Rights Management Client for Office, I have the sensitivity label available to me in the ribbon, and I can mark it as a piece of information. So here I've marked it as protected personal information. If we scroll down to the bottom, you'll see that it's applied a watermark label to this document. So now everyone who sees it will see that label, and you can define where on the page you want that label to go, top, bottom, what have you. It's going to be a watermark behind it, whatnot. So that's all available when you're defining your label, so that this transits then with the document once a sensitivity label has been applied to it. So that keeps management of the content no matter where it goes. Documents, emails, right? They all follow the same set of rules, so that this content is then protected in your organization as it trends through its life cycle. And this can be in the content creation stage. So we're not even talking about final records disposition. We're talking about managing, controlling, and protecting content in the collaborative stage while it's being potentially modified and reviewed and transited throughout the organization before it ever gets deposited into a record center, or before retention of policy is applied to it at a higher level, giving us a lot of control about how we manage sensitive information in our organization and what we do with it, and also how we find it later through things like e-discovery, where we can go and craft discovery searches with specific types of information, or looking for specific labels, or what have you. So I know that's a lot. A lot of stuff to cover in a very short period of time. One of the things I want to just mention to you and leave you with this before we flip back over to the demo and then the Q&A is that content management principles are pretty universally accepted across countries in this particular space. And there are organizations that you can join or that have content available to you to help you understand more about ECM and records management and information protection as an entire concept, maybe not specifically about Microsoft. And I bring this slide up because in 2010, we wrote the ECM Implementers course for Microsoft. Here are our main authors. You probably recognize some of these faces. And we worked with Microsoft to put together a whole big course. Now that course is no longer available because it was for the 2010 content, but if you go to the AIM site that I've linked there, or AIM in general, if that link is no longer valid, you can see that a lot of the principles that we applied then and are still available in the platform now are referenced by this industry organization about how you should manage content in an enterprise. So even if you find that you want to implement a particular set of ECM principles in your organization, and maybe the tools aren't quite there yet, or you want to do it all in Office 365, and Microsoft hasn't quite gotten those features yet, you can see where they're going with that. And how you could manage the features that you do have available to you to implement the best you can, the policies that you're trying to put into effect inside of your organization. And more importantly, you can learn more about this and take a deeper dive into how and where you should apply these types of concepts. So in the interest of time, let's go ahead and flip it back to Syskit, and then I'll rejoin you in a few minutes for the Q&A.
So thank you, Eric, for the awesome presentation. It was really great. And remember, folks, if you have any questions for Eric, feel free to submit them for our Q&A session. But before that, we are going to turn things over to our lead product owner, Mario, for a quick demo on how Syskit Point can help with your enterprise content management. Mario, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Ivan. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Eric, for a great presentation. So my name is Mario, and I will show you how our tool Syskit Point can help you with gaining better visibility on your content and content security. So Syskit Point is our solution for Microsoft 365 governance and security that empowers admins, IT pros, and end users to bring cloud security to the next level. It provides you with full visibility of the whole Microsoft 365 environment, and you can easily see who has access to your content, who is doing what with your content, who are guest users, where they have access, and it can help you with automating your company governance policies. So let's start with the demo. I hope you see my screen with Syskit Point. So Syskit Point offers a central visibility for everything in your tenant. So from one screen, you can see all the inventory of all your sites, teams, groups, and OneDrive in the tenant. And from this screen, you can dig into more details. For example, you can easily find which of your workspaces are marked as a confidential or any other sensitivity label you have. For example, you can see I have V1s, and you can go into more details. So let's drill down to the administration side. And from here, you can check which content you have in that site. So let's explore. We can see here all the files, folders, and document libraries in that site. Let's go back, and of course you can also see all the users group, security groups, and members of those groups who have access to this site. Let's go back to the overview screen. From here you can also generate a report for multiple sites and see where who has access to those sites, and you can also check who is doing what with your content. So let's check this one executive authority team and check file and page activities report. And with this report, actually, you can track activities on your content and do detailed forensic analysis. So, for example, you can see that user admin viewed this file sales plan. Okay, let's go back. You can also track and monitor external and guest users. So, for example, you can go to the users and filter by external users and see on which content they have access and what they are doing with your content. So let's look at an example of user Adele. And we can generate a report and check on which teams, groups, and sites this user has access from the team site level down to the document level. Okay, let's go back and let's move on to the next topic. So with Syskit Point, you can track your content through its entire life cycle. So from the beginning, when the teams and groups are created, to the end when the content is not needed anymore. So you can create different provisioning templates, which will be used for creating new sites, groups, and teams, and define different settings in those templates. So, for example, you can allow or disable external sharing, you can enforce privacy settings, and you can even define different sensitivity labels for different templates. Okay, I already have created a few templates. Let's check this one, confidential internal project. Okay, here are a lot of settings available in the template, but I will skip those settings and go to the sensitivity label. You can define which sensitivity will have all the teams and groups created based on that template. And what is also great here, you can make this template available only to specific users or groups. So, for example, if only employees from legal or finance team need to be able to create confidential content, then you can also do that. So you can define a rule, for example, where department is, I don't know, finance, and then only employees with the department finance will be able to to create new teams and groups based on that template. Then you can also schedule periodical access reviews to ask content owners to review who has access to the content of their sites, groups, and teams. So this is often also needed because of regulatory compliance, and auditors often request some proof that access review is performed regularly. So admins first need to configure access review policies. For example, if owners will need to review just externally shared content or everything. So let's look at an example. Okay, I can create new policy and choose what will be reviewed. For example, I can choose all content on just share content. And admins need to define the recurrence, and also they need to define, for example, that sensitive content needs to be reviewed quarterly and other content needs to be reviewed yearly. Okay, so and when the time comes, Syskit Point will send an email to owners, and they will receive a notification that they need to perform access review. Click here, and they will be redirected to Syskit Point with a list of their teams and groups which they need to review. And they need to check members. For example, they can see owners, members, guests. They can remove some users if needed. And when they are satisfied, they can also check externally shared content or all content shared outside the group. And when they are satisfied, they can complete the review. And after that, admins can track the progress of access review, see who performed review of their content and who didn't. Okay, and at the end, when the team is not needed anymore and team or group becomes inactive, Syskit Point can notify team owners and ask them if they want to archive, keep, or delete the team. So again, they will receive an email and they need to choose what to do with their team. Yes, so that was very a brief Syskit Point demo. We came to the end of this demo. We have seen how Point can give you the central inventory of your environment and how it helps you with protecting your content, securing your content and access through the entire lifecycle. Ivan, we can go back to you.
Sure. Thanks, Mario, for the excellent presentation. Now it's time for our Q&A session with Eric. So please feel free to ask anything using a Q&A function at the top right. Eric, are you ready?
I'm ready. Hit me with it.
Okay, so it's more of a remark or than a question. So Lauren actually asked that Microsoft doesn't recommend using Record Center anymore. Everything is now focused on the compliance labels. So could you expand upon that subject?
Well, Microsoft recommends all sorts of things, like creating, an entirely flat hierarchy of site collections and never using subsites again, which we know is preposterous. So what may work for Microsoft doesn't necessarily work for your organization. We're in this strange phase right now where Microsoft is transitioning towards this tenant level management of ECM and specifically records, and we still have sort of localized record management inside of SharePoint. The problem is that at the tenant level, you don't have the same capabilities that you have for, especially for records management and disposition, that you do have at the localized in sort of legacy SharePoint, as it were. So depending on your needs, that may or may not work for you. What I try to advise clients to do is use a bit of both, right, where they make sense. So some of the cool things that you can do inside of Office 365 is to auto-assign labels to your content. So if you go into records management in the Compliance Center and you have those label policies, you can say, okay, auto-assign label, and you pick a scope and it could go across, your multiple repositories that can apply a label. Really cool feature. Can't do that in the legacy features, but at the same time, you lack the granular retention and disposition policy that you have in the classic record center, and you lack that concept of I'm going to take something from one place and put it into a record repository. Now is probably not the time to make any major decisions on direction for how you're going to implement this. If you're already doing some localized records management, keep doing what you're doing. Take advantage of the Office 365 policies that are available to you. Start moving slightly or in increments to that. As that feature set matures and they do better, and it is coming, believe me, there's a big team working on this inside of Microsoft. They're doing a great job, but it's a lot of stuff, right? And it's going to take time for it all to get done and get done the right way. So certainly take advantage of those things at sort of tenant concepts that we have in the Compliance Center now where you can, but there's no reason you should throw the baby out with the bathwater and not use some of the classic features if they work for what your organization is trying to do.
Thanks for that, Eric. So I know we hit our 1 hour mark, but one more question that just came in from Jeremy. So are these features / capabilities for SharePoint Online only, or can it work with on-premise SharePoint Server too?
Yeah. So most of what I showed you up until the last 15 minutes or so is classic on-prem. Even though I was showing it to you in Office 365, all of those features are available in SharePoint all the way up from 2010 all the way up to SE. Record centers and retention policies and content types, publishing, all that is there in classic. The modern stuff that you do in the Compliance Center is Office 365 only. Things like your sensitivity labels and whatnot defined at the tenant level, your policies, doing auto assignment and whatnot, your information protection pieces, those are Office 365. If you're in a hybrid environment, you can take advantage of both, do a little bit of both, which is great if that's where you fit into it. If you're still on-prem and looking at going to the cloud, the first thing is determine what cloud you're going to be in, because it varies by cloud, whether it's government or commercial, and region in some cases. And then start planning for how you can supplant the on-prem features with what's in the cloud. You can move right now, your classic record centers can move to Office 365, no problem. It still all works. But you're going to get a whole wealth of new capabilities in with your tenant modern stuff in O365. So start looking at how you can implement those to help you on your ECM journey. There's a lot of stuff there really useful to you, especially if you're coming from on-prem and haven't implemented them yet. So a great time to start your investigation.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Eric. So I'm sure Jeremy will appreciate that. And I know we are on our mark, so I would like to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar. And as mentioned, everyone who's registered will receive a recording of the webinar within a few days. And Eric, once again, thanks to you as well for joining us today and for giving out a great presentation.
You bet.
Thank you. And if you have any further questions, guys, please, regarding Syskit Point or any of our other products, reach out to us at sales@syskit.com. It was a pleasure having you all here, and see you next time. Goodbye.